I know a lot of brethren wanted to keep time on me. They wanted to come up here, about 5 minutes before I'm supposed to quit. And none of them were willing to pay enough money to get up here. I'm not sure any of them had enough money to get up here. In Isaiah 62 and verse 2, Isaiah says that the Gentiles shall see thy righteousness and all kings thy glory, and thou shalt be called by a new name which the mouth of the Lord shall name. In the book, and I will encourage people, if you have not gotten the book, to get one. I'm going to skip over a lot of the material that's in the book because there's not enough time to even get the material that I want to get to. But I did deal with the aspect of the timing of this new name as to when it was going to be given, and thus what the new name is, because there is some controversy on that, along with some other aspects that you can read in the book. But suffice it to say that the new name that is going to be named by the mouth of the Lord is that name of Christian. And so if y'all haven't turned y'all's cell phones off, you might as well. It's the name of Christian. We see it immediately after the Gentiles receive the gospel of Jesus Christ, set forth in Acts 11th chapter and verse 26, where it says that when he found him, that's Barnabas seeking out Saul of Tarsus, and who later is the Apostle Paul, that he brought him unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. And so here's this new name that had not been given prior to this time. Other names that were used in reference to Christians had been used before this time. In fact, many of them even used during the Old Testament times. But here is a name that is totally new. It comes at the right time after the Gentiles see the righteousness of God, after kings, and there's a study on the idea of what kings refers to in the book. But after the kings had seen the glory of God, and so here's this new name being given. Also have a section in the book dealing with it coming from the mouth of the Lord. While some think it was a term given in derision by the enemies of Christ, that's not the case. It was truly one that came from God. And it is a name that we use today. We use it to describe ourselves very often. And so let's look at this name of Christian. It very simply means Christ-like. When you're dealing with the word Christ-like, the word Christ is a Greek term that is equivalent to the Hebrew Messiah. But it means anointed one. And thus the term Christian means like the anointed one. When we go back into the Old Testament, we find the basis of the idea of anointing and the anointed offices, and we see that there are 3 offices in the Old Testament that are anointed offices. We see, for example, the term and the office of the priesthood in Exodus the 30th chapter and verse 30, and Leviticus 16 and verse 32. Prophets were anointed, as we see in 1 Kings 19 and verse 16. And while that's the only specific reference, there are other ideas or terms that are individuals that are referred to as anointed, and the idea of that prophet being anointed. And then there's the idea of kings being anointed in 1 Samuel 10 and verse 1 and 1 Samuel 15 and verse 1. And thus these are the anointed offices. Jesus is called the Christ in the sense that He is anointed in all three of these offices. He was anointed as the priest of God. In Hebrews 2 and verse 17, we read, "Wherefore in all things it behooved Him to be made like unto His brethren, that He might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people." But He is that merciful and faithful high priest. Just a few verses later, chapter 3 and verse 1, "Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Jesus Christ." And so Jesus is referred throughout the book of Hebrews as that great high priest. When we look at the work of a priest, the Hebrews writer again tells us the work of a priest in chapter 5 and verse 1 when he says, "For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins." A few chapters later, chapter 8 and verse 3, he says, "For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices." And then speaking specifically of Christ, he adds, "Wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer." He had to offer gifts and sacrifices, and his was certainly for sins. And I'm not going to take the time to develop the priesthood of Christ this morning, as we would spend all of our time dealing with that and not move on to other aspects. But it is an interesting study that He was that merciful and faithful high priest. There were things in relationship to man and things in relationship to God that a priest had to perform. And as a result of that, when Jesus comes on the scene, and to be Christ, He had to be man, and He also had to be God. And so you see the dual nature of Jesus, that He is the incarnate one, the God-man. One of the reasons is so He can offer gifts and sacrifices, so that He can be that great high priest. He could not offer His blood, which is what He was going to do for the salvation of man, for the cleansing of man's sins. That's the priesthood, and the sacrifices that He offered was His blood. He couldn't do it here upon this earth. He went into heaven, though, and there in heaven He was able to offer that sacrifice for our sins. He didn't have to go into that, what represented heaven, the most holy place, every year to offer sacrifices, as the high priest would on the Day of Atonement have to go into that place to offer the sacrifices first for himself and then for the people. He went into heaven itself to offer sacrifices once for all time. And a good study of that would be in Hebrews the 9th and the 10th chapters. Deals with that quite extensively. But Jesus was that great priest, that great high priest who offered His blood as a sacrifice for our sins. But Jesus was also that great prophet of God. The word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetes, which means literally to speak forth. It is dealing with one who speaks forth for someone else. It can have a secular meaning, it can have a religious meaning, and it can have a specific, and generally we use it in that specific idea of one who speaks miraculously for God. But it's not always used that way. Well, Jesus was that great high priest in that He was speaking for God. In Matthew the 17th chapter, on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Peter says, "Let's build here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elijah." A voice out of heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye Him." Why hear Him? Because He is the one who is that spokesman for God. In John the 12th chapter, verse 48 through verse 50, Jesus says that he that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him. The words that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day. For I have not spoken of myself. I'm going to come back to this word "of" there in just a minute. But I have not spoken of myself, but the Father which sent me. He gave me a commandment, what I should say and what I should speak. And I know that His commandment is life everlasting. Whatsoever I speak, therefore, even as the Father said unto me, so I speak. I said I was going to come back to this word of. When He says, I've not spoken of myself. It comes from the Greek word ek. And we would recognize that from the term church, ecclesia. The idea of ek is called out, ecclesia is called out, but it deals with the idea of ek is out from within. He's saying, I did not speak out from within myself. The ideas, the thoughts, the words that I'm speaking do not come from me. They came from the Father. The source, the origin of those words are His, not mine. I'm not speaking from myself. Why? Because the Father gave Him those words to speak. And that's what we read in Hebrews, the first chapter, in verse 1 and verse 2. That God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the world. And so here we are, we see Jesus, and here is Jesus being the spokesman for God today. And those last days are those days of the Christian dispensation. The days that began on Pentecost of Acts 2nd chapter and continued on and will continue on until Christ comes again the second time. And during that time, that period of time, we're to hear Him. We're to hear Christ. Why? Because He's not speaking from Himself, but He had a message from the Father. And the words that He spoke, even the very meaning and the terms that are found there in John the 12th chapter in verse 48 through 50. One of them deals with the very utterance of the words, and the other one deals with the meaning of the words. Both of them came from the Father. The very utterance, the very meaning of those words, they came from the Father, and I'm just the mouthpiece. What is it? He was that great prophet of God. But also we see that Jesus was anointed as the King. In 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, verse 15, Paul writes, which in His times He shall show who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords. This idea is repeated in Revelation, the 17th chapter, that these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. And then in chapter 19 and verse 16, that He hath on His vesture and on His thigh a name written, King of kings and Lord of lords. Jesus is King. Not as the premillennialists would teach. The premillennialists are actually Antichrist, because they oppose the kingship of our Lord and Master Jesus Christ. They say He's king in prospect, He's going to be king, but they deny His kingship right now. Jesus is king, He's ruling and reigning now. He's ruling at the right hand of God, sitting on David's throne, which is Solomon's or God's throne. It doesn't matter how you refer to it. He is sitting and ruling. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 25. Paul says, for He must reign till He hath put all enemies under His feet. He's reigning till that time. In other words, He's reigning now. In Ephesians 1st chapter, verse 21 through verse 23, it says that God hath put all, that Jesus is far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come. And hath put all things under His feet, and gave Him to be the head over all things to the church, which is His body, the fullness of Him that filleth all in all. Notice, Christ is the head of the church. But He doesn't limit it to the church. What James Bales and now then Dan Billingsley and others who have followed their teachings on the covenant idea, what they're saying is Christ has no rule and reign except over those who are in the church. this says, yes, He said of the church, but He's also over, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named. Yes, He said of the church, but He's also King of kings and Lord of lords. And so they, in a sense, denied the very kingship of Jesus Christ by their doctrine. But that's Christ. He was anointed in all three of those offices. Now then, let's make the application, though, to us. We are to be Christians. What is it? Like the Anointed One. In other words, we are to be anointed in the same way that Christ was anointed. Now let's look at it. We are to be priests. That was one of those offices that Christ was anointed. We mentioned from Hebrews 5 in verse 1 and Hebrews 8 in verse 3 that the work of a priest was that of offering gifts and sacrifices. Turn over, though, now to 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. In verse 5, he says, "Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." Verse 9, he continues on, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of Him that called you out of glory into His marvelous light." In the Old Testament, they offered sacrifices for sins. Christ made that ultimate sacrifice for all sins. How can we be priests? Because we offer spiritual sacrifices. That's what verse 5 says. We are a holy priesthood for what purpose? For offering up sacrifices. Spiritual sacrifices that will be acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Notice in verse 9 again, he emphasizes the fact that we are a holy nation. For what purpose? Or a royal priesthood. For what purpose? To show forth the praises or the glories of Him who hath called us out of darkness into His light. There's those spiritual sacrifices, those glories that we set forth by the lifestyle that we live. Turn back over to Hebrews the 13th chapter, verse 15 and 16. And the Hebrews writer states, "By Him, therefore," that's by Christ, "let us offer the sacrifice of praise." Notice both terms that we saw in 1 Peter. Spiritual sacrifices. Well, here is the sacrifice of praise. To offer up or show forth the praises of Him. Here's the sacrifice of praise. And notice the word every once in a while. "By Him, therefore, let us offer up the sacrifice of praise to God on Sunday mornings only." That's what some of our brethren would believe. And that's what some of our brethren practice. But that's not what it says. It says continually. This is a lifestyle that we are living. It's not something that we put on when we come into a building such as this, and then when we leave, we take it off to go about our everyday business. These are things that we do within our lifestyle. Now then, what is it? That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to His name, but to do good and to communicate, forget not. For with such sacrifices, what is the work of a priest? To offer these sacrifices. What are we to offer? Here's these three things. And Hebrew writer says, with these sacrifices, God is well pleased. Now let's look at these three things. The fruit of our lips. We can't give a full sermon on each one of these, which might be good, but fruit of our lips certainly would include singing. I found out just yesterday a little interesting fact. We had a visitor come several weeks ago, and people who brought him have invited him, tried to get him to come back. He said no. Finally found out why. In my sermon, I said instrumental music was sinful. He won't return because of that. It says the fruit of our lips, not the fruit of our instruments, mechanical instruments of music. We are commanded to sing in relationship to our worship to God. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, other passages certainly show that. We oftentimes, though, when we're reading and studying in relationship, and as preachers preaching sermons dealing with the subject of instrumental music and showing that what God has authorized is singing. He never authorized in New Testament worship to Him, in the singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, the playing of instruments and music. And we emphasize that, and rightly so. But we also need to be emphasizing just as strongly to our own members and our own selves sometimes that it is the authorization to sing. We are to offer the fruit of our lips to God. How many times, though, do you see someone who comes in and during the worship, and maybe song leaders more than us preachers, and they never open their mouth to sing? They never offer the fruit of their lips in that regard. Rather, this is authorization. We need to be doing this. But also, it would include our prayers to God, wouldn't it? That's our fruit, the fruit of our lips. Christ certainly taught us to pray. Matthew the 6th chapter. Paul tells us to pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians 5th chapter. We see that the fervent prayer of a righteous man will avail much. James the 5th chapter, verse 16. And how many times do we see Christians praying? And how many times do we really spend time in prayer? Now, if somebody gets up and leads prayer and it goes on for 3 or 4 minutes, we start peeking in our watch. Man, this sure is a long prayer. Now, our Wednesday night service used to be called prayer service. Now we get maybe 1 or 2 prayers, short prayers, and there's nothing wrong with the way in which we do things on Wednesday nights. I'm not saying that, but the emphasis many times maybe should be changed to more prayer. If we want to go out and convert the world, why aren't we praying for those individuals that we're trying to work with? We have people starting to fall away, become weak. Why aren't we praying for those individuals by name? We need to be fervent and spend time in prayer. Look at the life of Christ as a good illustration. We need to realize that our lips, our mouth can do so much good for the Lord, but it can also do so much evil. That's his discussion in James the 3rd chapter. He's showing the power of the tongue, both for good and for evil, depending on how we use it. Brethren, we need to start using our tongues to bring forth the sacrifices of praise to God, the fruit of our lips, being that faithful priest of God. But also, he says, not only the fruit of our lips, but to do good. And we need to be doing good to others. Christianity is, to a great extent, going to be defined by the goodness that we do in all aspects within our entirety of life. There are just passage after passage within the New Testament telling us that we were, for example, Ephesians 2 and verse 10, created unto good works. That we have, Titus 2 and verse 14, that Christ purified unto himself a peculiar people zealous of good works. When we go back to Matthew the 25th chapter, verse 31 through 46, Jesus bases the judgment upon our good works. We need to be known as a people who are doing good works. And many times we're not. We need to be involved in those. Dorcas is a great illustration of a lady who did good works. As after she had died, and here's Peter, and he comes in, and the widows are showing the alms deeds and the things which she had made. She was full of good works, doing things for others. And then the third word there that's used, communicate. Forget not. The word communicate is a word that generally often is translated fellowship. Have a fellowship. What is that? What do we mean by that? Well, number one, certainly when we give of our means upon the first day of the week and use that money in support of gospel preachers, we are having fellowship with them. When we sit down and write a note to an evangelist, to someone who's in a foreign field or in a difficult work, and we send that note to them to encourage them, we're having fellowship with that individual. When we sit down and we pray for those individuals, we're having fellowship with them. There are many ways in which we can have fellowship in relationship to these doing of good works and the fruit of our lips. We need to be doing that more and more, brethren. Encouraging one another, strengthening one another, fellowshipping one another in the good work that we're involved in. So we are to be priests of God. But second, we are to be prophets. I realize when I say this that some are going to raise their ears and kind of, the hairs on the back of their neck is going to bristle, because we generally use the term in relationship to someone who is inspired of God. If anyone says that that's what I'm saying here, you're lying. I'm not. There's no one that is inspired of God today. But brethren, we have an inspired book that we need to be preaching. And when we preach that inspired word, we are speaking for God. That's the idea of a prophet. One who speaks forth for God, a spokesman for God. Brethren, we need to be going out and preaching the word. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2. We have been given a commission. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. We need to be fulfilling our obligation and our responsibility in preaching the Word. Paul told Timothy, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, that the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to tell others also. I've told you, you tell someone else, they are to tell someone else, who's to tell someone else, who's to tell someone else, and it continues on. And each one of us are to be faithful in that charge. But when we start teaching false doctrine, we're not being faithful. When we start preaching things other than God's Word, we're not being faithful in that. We're being disloyal to our Lord and Master Jesus Christ. When we get up and spend an entire sermon, as someone was mentioning last night, I believe. Had to have one reference in the Bible, but the rest of it was nice short stories and jokes and everything like that. We're not being the type of prophet that God expects us to be. Preach the Word. But let's not limit it to buildings such as this. We need to be getting out among people and preaching the gospel to them. I realize that we within the Lord's church today are facing great problems. We have false doctrines that are all around us, that continue to rear their ugly head. And we have to be defenders of the truth. But when we, or if we allow ourselves to center our minds just upon that, and it has to be done, but we do that to the exclusion of teaching others, spreading the truth, then we're wrong as well. It has to be both. Paul was certainly a great defender of the truth. He fought against false teachers and false teaching. But he was also out evangelizing. That's our responsibility and obligation today as well. In being a prophet for God, we are to be a spokesman. We're to be preaching and teaching God's Word, not man's words and man's ideas. I developed this a little bit more in the chapter, but we are to be out doing that type of a work. We are to be that prophet of God, not from a miraculous standpoint today, except we proclaim a miraculously given book that was inspired word by God. And that's what we preach and teach. Sometimes I've used the idea of witness. The apostles were witnesses. We cannot witness for Christ today. We're not qualified to do that. But we certainly better be giving their testimony to others. Teaching their testimony and their witnessing to others. That's our responsibility as being a Christian. But then we're also to be kings and therefore reign with Christ. Some people can understand, yes, I can understand how we're to be priests. I can understand how we're to be prophets, but man, when we get to that idea of a king, I can't see that. I can't understand. It seems, if anything, the world's ruling over us and Satan. And no. Being a Christian is being a king. In Romans the 8th chapter, in verse 37, he says, "Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us." Who's a conqueror? What does a conqueror do? He sits down to reign. He's the victor. And Paul is saying we as Christians, and if you go back and read the context, dealing with things of this life and all things. He says none of those things that he lists there can separate us from the love of God. But in the midst of that, we are more than conquerors. We are victorious over all of these things. Romans 5th chapter, in verse 17, Paul would say, "For if by one man's offense death reigned, much more they which receive abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one Jesus Christ." When do we reign? We reign in heaven, don't we? Well, when we get to heaven, that's what... No. We're reigning now, he says. We reign in life. We're reigning now. How? When we become a Christian, what happens to our sins? They're washed away. We're raised then to walk in newness of life. What is that life? It is a life of living separate and apart from sin. Isn't that what Romans 6th chapter really is all about? That you have been baptized, you've been buried with Christ in baptism, you were raised up to walk in newness of life. And then notice, for example, verses 12 through verse 14. "Let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal bodies, that ye should obey the lust, obey it in the lust thereof." In other words, you don't allow sin to reign over you. But what do? You reign over sin. Goes on. "Neither yield your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under law, but under grace. What is it? Person in the world, person who's not a Christian, sin's reigning over his life. He is a slave to sin. But when you become a Christian, you died to that old man of sin, and now then you're living for Christ, and you're living and ruling over sin. You're ruling over that wickedness. You're not allowing it to control your life. You instead have controlled your life to submit yourself unto God, and your members as instruments of righteousness. Christian's not a sinner, as some people said. If he is, he's not a Christian. The two ideas are contradictory. If you're a Christian, you're not a sinner. If you're a sinner, you're not a Christian. Will the Christian commit sin? Yes. But his lifestyle is one of ruling over sin. That's being a victor. That's being a king with Christ. And because we are reigning over sin, we then are going to reign over Satan and over death. That's teaching 1 Corinthians 15th chapter, verse 54 through 57. So that when this corruptible shall put on incorruption, and this mortal shall put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory, our Lord Jesus Christ. No wonder Paul could say, for me to live is Christ. What is that? That's ruling and reigning over sin as well. But what happens? To die is gain. Death will be gain for the Christian, because he is ruling over sin within his life. Are we Christians by God's ideas and by God's definition? We'd better be. If we're not, then we need to change our life to become the type of individual that God wants us to be. A true Christian. Now, put on my director's hat instead.